Welcome to the Wellbeing and Career World podcast. I'm delighted to be chatting with a gentleman who currently co-hosts the show Happy Hour with Heather and guest. He writes crime fiction novellas, short stories, and volunteers. In 2018, he survived a ruptured brain aneurysm, and I've asked him already before we started recording this, if I have the pronunciation correct, a subarachnoid hemorrhage. He's going to start a clinical mental health counselling program in January 2022. Today, we'll be chatting about Brain Aneurysm Awareness. A very warm welcome to the podcast, Andrew Davie. How are you getting on today, Andrew?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me.
No, but my pleasure. Let's get to start. So where are you right now on planet Earth?
So I'm currently in Alexandria, Virginia.
Oh, nice.
That's where I've lived for the last, I guess, almost 8 years now.
What's Alexandria, Virginia like? So if you're trying to picture it in no more than 10 words, tell us.
It's about a half an hour south of Washington, D.C. So it's very similar. It's kind of like a D.C. suburb.
Right. And is it pretty quiet, is it?
Yeah, it's pretty quiet. It's easy to get into Washington, D.C. By the metro. So I have enjoyed living here. It's a nice area.
And have you lived anywhere else in the States?
Yeah, well, I grew up in New York City. That's where I spent the first 18 years of my life, roughly. And then I went to college in New Orleans, Louisiana. I was there for a couple of years. And then I moved back to New York and lived in a bunch of the outer boroughs. So in Queens for a little while. And then I spent 2 years teaching abroad in Asia. So I was in Macau and Hong Kong.
Well, did you go to the casinos?
I did. Well, it's funny because I was in Macau on a Fulbright scholarship to teach.
Right.
So technically, we were all considered to be government employees. Okay. And it's forbidden to gamble if you're a government employee. So we did go to the casino, but we would only usually go to the restaurant, or we would pass through. But yeah, it was certainly a very interesting place to be.
Yeah, it's a bit different from Hong Kong, isn't it?
Oh yeah, well it's very much. I'm not sure if you've ever been to Atlantic City in New Jersey or Las Vegas, Nevada. I've never been to Monaco,
right.
But those are the only sort of. Macau is sort of like the destination spot in Asia just to gamble.
Right.
So it's very much geared exclusively. There's really not much else to do. It had been like a very kind of quiet Portuguese colony
right.
a long time ago. So it's really interesting because all of the signs and all the directions and everything is in Portuguese. But all the people speak Cantonese.
Right.
And then, of course, I was teaching in English. But it's strange because it's very much like a culturally Portuguese and Asian, but like right next door to a 5-star hotel that caters to gambling. So it's a unique place, certainly.
And did you pick up, Andrew, any Cantonese while you were there, although you were teaching English?
I did. When I was in Macau, so Cantonese is predominantly spoken in both Macau and Hong Kong, although since they both cater to so many foreign populations, everybody pretty much speaks English. Right. So I didn't really need to learn that much Cantonese. And it wasn't something that I was really interested in. So I picked up how to say things like good morning, good night. I still remember how to say large coffee, please. That was one of the things I made sure. I was really proud of myself when I would, anywhere that I went where I would order coffee, they would understand me in English, but it was the only chance that I could really practice. So
do you still know that now, Andrew? How do you say large coffee, please?
Yeah, yit cafe mgoy.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay, very, very fancy. So how long did it take you to learn that?
Not very. I mean, that because that one is simple. But if you were to ask me more complex phrases, I probably wouldn't remember anything.
Right.
I had when I was in Macau, I had a roommate who was also teaching there in the same program, and he was very interested in learning the language. So every night he would make flashcards
Right.
to remember either phrases or characters. So he was really dedicated. And I was much more interested in just enjoying myself and going out in the evenings and sort of taking in what the nightlife had to offer. So we had very different experiences. But
And what about the food? Did you enjoy the Asian food?
Oh yeah, it was great. It's a unique place because it's certainly Asian food, but there's a Portuguese sort of accent to it. So right. It was a really interesting combination of flavors. And then Hong Kong is another great place as well, because you can, it's really incorporated so much of the world's culture,
yes.
So you can find everything. But yeah, we would find these sort of little pockets in Macau that specialized in, in really great Asian food, or, if you needed to get pizza, you could find it, or something. Some of the creature comforts from home would be there if you knew where to look.
I used to love Hong Kong because of the buildings, because it reminded me, especially at nighttime, what New York was like. And then I'm very interested to know, you mentioned there that the first 18 years of your life, you grew up in New York. What was that like? Is it like as we see on the TV? Is it quite exciting? Is there a certain amount of tension in the city at times because it's so busy? What was that like?
Well, I didn't really have the perspective for it until I left. Growing up, I wouldn't really think so much about the things that were enjoyable or easy to do. I never owned a car growing up, so I was always sort of imagining what it was like to have a car when you're 16 and drive to a house party somewhere, or all of the sort of things that I had imagined most people would experience in their lives. You
right.
don't really get that in New York City. There's really no backyard or things along those lines. There's like, I would go to Central Park. So it's certainly a unique place. I began to appreciate things much more when I was in my 20s and I had moved back.
Right.
And the ease with which you could get like a falafel at 3:00 in the morning.
Yeah.
Or one night go see a show, the next night see a movie, and then go to a sporting event, and never having to worry about drinking and driving or any of these sorts of things that you don't really consider when you're younger, right. Because it's all you know. I loved it. It is very fast paced. And I kind of liked that aspect of it when I was younger. As I got older, I wanted something a little bit more slower. Right. So that's, eventually that's how I ended up in Alexandria. But
and is there much? I mean, is it like we see in the movies where you see the yellow cab driver, pulling over the side of the road if you cross the sidewalk, and he goes, "Yeah, what are you doing, buddy?" And is there much community spirit there with the general local population?
Well, it's interesting because that's all that ever sort of gets shown on TV, or when you think culturally about New York City, you think about almost getting hit by a cab, and all of that stuff happens.
Yeah.
But that's maybe like 5 to 10% of it, and the rest of it, it isn't really anything outstanding to discuss. It's just sort of normal everyday life.
Right.
There is a certain, if you've lived in a big city before, you've probably seen a lot of the same things. Right. Everyone waking up in the morning and going to work and traveling on the train or on the bus or something like that. There definitely is a certain amount of craziness in New York. But I think that tends to dominate every conversation. So it reminds me when when I had a friend of mine who became a rabbi, and part of his process, he had to live in Israel for a year. So I would ask him, are you ever concerned? Because all I see on the news about Israel is, either fighting or protests or something. And he said, yeah, that's what they show you on the news, but that's not 24 hours a day, every place you go.
Right.
So I remember thinking that's very similar. When you think of New York, you probably think, don't go out at night because you could get mugged, or watch out for the cab drivers driving,
Yes.
or look out for the crazy Yankees and Mets fans that are going to be drunk at the bar. And that certainly exists, but it's not as big of a factor as you think when you sort of are looking from the outside.
Well, I've been a few times now. I have to say, I love it as a tourist. It's such an exciting place, especially if you go to, as you mentioned, a show. You go to Broadway. There's just so much excitement there, just especially as a tourist. So let's generally move on then to brain aneurysm awareness. So for somebody, an idiot like me, Andrew, what is a brain aneurysm?
So you can have an aneurysm all throughout your body. For a brain aneurysm, what I had, it's basically like a vein or a blood vessel bursts. It's kind of like if you were to overinflate a tire, and the tire just blows a spot in it. So I ended up having like a blood vessel in my brainstem rupture. And that was the cause. But you can have an aneurysm pretty much anywhere, from what I understand. I'm actually not so much an expert on the medical or scientific side.
So how old were you then? I mean, kind of take a step a little bit back then. So did you have any symptoms? Anything that was of a concern that you kind of thought, like, my vision is impaired or anything?
So I had actually just turned 40 years old the week before.
Okay.
And I was at the airport. I was going to take a flight that morning. And I felt fine. I didn't have any symptoms until I got to the gate at the airport, and I started to sweat uncontrollably, like I had just run a marathon.
Right.
And I remember thinking, this is strange. But I sort of thought, okay, I might be coming down with the flu. I didn't immediately go to, I'm about to have a brain aneurysm. And then they called my group to board the plane. And I remember lifting my backpack and thinking, it feels like it has cinder blocks in it. It was really heavy.
Right.
Which again is a red flag. But at the time, I don't think I was thinking that anything really wrong was happening.
Right.
And then fortunately, when I tried to board the plane, I fell on the jetway, and first responders were able to get to me immediately because I was out in the open and I'd fallen, and that is actually what ended up saving my life, because had I been anywhere else, no one would have gotten to me in time.
Right.
So I didn't have any symptoms or anything. Most people that I've either spoken to who've had a similar thing or that I've read about will suggest that they've had something known as a thunderclap headache, which is supposed to be the worst feeling headache you've ever had before. That usually accompanies, the aneurysm. Right. I didn't have that. I was very fortunate that none of it was painful. I do remember hearing somebody tell me not to move and thinking, okay, I won't move. Right. And then I said, I can't miss my flight, because I was just, I didn't know how bad things were. I just thought how upset my family will be that I missed a flight.
Right.
So the person laughed and said, don't worry, you can catch another flight. Because I guess they probably knew that this was more of a serious thing.
And were you conscious throughout this, Andrew? I mean, you mentioned there that you didn't want to miss your flight. But did you have any can you remember anything at all other than just
Yeah, no,
collapsing?
up until that point, I remember pretty much enough of the details, like lifting the backpack and it being heavy and sweating, and scanning my ticket and trying to walk and noticing that the floor was shifting,
Right.
like like I was at an amusement park funhouse. And I remember thinking to myself, instead of thinking this is definitely strange and I have a problem, I thought I need to gather enough momentum to get onto the plane. Because I guess I wasn't thinking clearly.
Right.
And then I fell, and the person said to me, "Don't move." And I remember I was fitted with a neck brace, and that's when I said I can't miss my flight. And then I don't remember anything after that for the next 3 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah, I have no memory. I was fortunately, I had filled out the emergency contact form when I booked my ticket. So
Right.
the airline called my parents and said that I had an incident and I missed my flight. And then later on, the neurosurgeon's physician's assistant found my cell phone and saw a bunch of missed calls. So he called my brother, who happened to be at my parents' house, and let them know what had happened, and they were able to either drive or fly up to Washington D.C. from where they were. And then the next 3 weeks, I was up and I was talking to people and I was following instructions, but I just have no memory of it.
That's amazing. I mean, it's obviously a good example of why when you go abroad or you go on a flight, it's always good to have contact details. So it was great that they were able to get in touch with relatives and keep them informed of what was going on. But leading up to this, and this is going to sound like an ignorant question on my behalf, but did you have any stresses in your life before I know you were saying you were kind of, you want to get this flight, but leading up to that before your 40th birthday, was there anything that may have created this brain aneurysm, or is it just one of those things that it can just happen?
I know there weren't any major life stressors that would have contributed to this. This is usually brain aneurysms like this. It's sort of like getting struck by lightning.
Right.
There's I think a lot of time it can be brought on if you have from what I've read, if you have like a very serious cocaine addiction.
Right.
That's been known to do it. It could be hereditary, or like myself, I just happen to be one of those rare people that gets it. But there hadn't been any. I didn't have any symptoms leading up to this, nor had there been any major life events that would have contributed to something like this happening. And I'm not even sure if any sort of stress or anything will bring about something like this. It may just be up to fortune's fate.
So when then you're getting your medical treatment and you're in the hospital, I know there was a gap of like 3 weeks, but what did the medical professionals tell you that you can remember with regards to your treatment and what you can expect in the recovery process? And how long were you in hospital in general? I mean, do you now have to go back to hospital to get checked up?
No, the first 3 weeks that I was there, I was in intensive care. I don't remember, but I think it was pretty much just making sure that I would be in the clear.
Right.
I was still there. There is something called a vasospasm, which I learned about, which is it can be like a complicated problem after the surgery. So they wanted to make sure that I was sort of out of harm's way. And then I stayed in the hospital for another week and a half after that, doing inpatient rehab. And that's when sort of I became cognizant again. I was able to function, and I have memories. So that was there wasn't really a lot of anticipation with this is how things may go from here on out, or this is sort of what trajectory your recovery is going to take. Most of it was just immediate, let's have you do these exercises so that you can learn to walk again. And we'll have you do these speech therapy exercises to see if your processing has been inhibited at all. So most of it for the week and a half that I was in the hospital, I didn't really think about the future so much or about what the recovery would be like. It was mostly just following directions. And, I needed a cane to walk at the beginning, and somebody held a guard belt, which was basically like an airplane seat belt that I'd put around my waist in case I teetered or started to fall, they could right me. Most of the time, any physical activity I did was in like a 40-second burst, and then I would either be in a wheelchair or I would have to sit down because I just didn't have the endurance. I had double vision, so I wore an eye patch for a little bit. So the first week and a half really was just like, go to physical therapy, try these exercises, go to occupational therapy, do these exercises, and speech language therapy and do these, and just sort of follow these exercises. I think in the beginning, I had accepted that something really traumatic had happened and it would take a long time to recover.
Right.
But I didn't know what that would look like. And then when I left the hospital, I stayed in my apartment, and my mother stayed with me, and she would take me to various appointments. So I did outpatient, physical therapy and speech therapy. And that's when I began to sort of try to adjust. I think there was, for a really long time, I imagined that at some point I would keep healing. Over time, I within the first year, I would say, I was able to walk without the cane. I was able to start exercising again. My double vision eventually went away. So physically, I was able to sort of recalibrate pretty quickly. And even now, the physical limitations I have are more of a nuisance than a problem.
Right.
My vision still takes time to settle if I move my head, and my balance isn't very good. But I've incorporated that into just what life is like now. What ended up taking the most time to feel comfortable is sort of the emotional adjustment afterward. I kept thinking that at some point I would feel like my old self again, that somehow my old life would come back. One day I would just feel, like I had before the aneurysm.
Yes.
And that didn't happen. So that took a while to sort of realize that there are going to be elements that I still have from before the aneurysm. Like I still live in the same apartment. I still have friends in the area that I see, but much of it was going to be new. And not allowing that to be overwhelming was sort of the major focus. And that took the longest time to kind of get comfortable with.
Can I ask you, Andrew? I mean, I'm trying to get my own picture here. So, say for example, you're now going through a recovery stage, and you're trying to again kind of start your movement, your speech. How was that like? I mean, you mentioned the emotional side there, but how? I just can't picture that where a couple of weeks before then you were walking normally, you were talking normally, you could move your hands, you could do everyday normal functions. How did your brain cope with that at that time to think, right, what is it like? I want to move my, is your mind thinking, I want to move my hand, but it's not doing it. I want to move my leg, it's not doing it. Is this the picture I'm getting, or is it totally different?
Well, for me, I was really fortunate that physically I didn't really have that difficult of a time. It was sort of like when you begin to exercise, it'll take time for you to develop your cardiovascular and put on muscle. It was the same type of thing.
Right.
So I could do everything that I had wanted to do. It just took time to build up. Like I would start by maybe walking around the block, and then within a week, maybe I could walk around the block twice without sitting down. And then in 2 weeks, I could walk around the block 3 times. And then, it was just it was easy to chart the progress physically.
Right.
Because there were always indications that I was improving. For example, what ended up happening is I think I was so focused on recovering physically first that the emotional recovery didn't really begin to happen until after I had made enough physical progress.
Right.
And a lot of it was sort of reflecting on the fact that many of the priorities I had had before the aneurysm weren't priorities anymore with regard to how I felt about them.
Okay.
So like, for example, I had, before the aneurysm, I had been dating a lot, hoping that, okay, maybe one day I'll meet somebody and I'll settle down and we can either get married or start a family, or, just have a relationship.
Right.
And then after the aneurysm, what I realized was that wasn't as important anymore. I also had difficulty making emotional connections with people. So I sort of realized that trying to get into a relationship with someone would probably not be the best idea right now.
Right.
So that took a while to kind of feel comfortable with, okay, well, if that's no longer a priority, what is a priority? Which is what actually led me to what I'm doing now as a student trying to pursue a counseling degree. But yeah, to go back to your question, physically, I could always sort of follow my brain's commands. It was more of like an existential, what am I going to do now type thing, right, that became more difficult to deal with.
You mentioned there the dating thing was kind of like a priority before you had the aneurysm. I mean, have you gotten to a stage now where your thought process, you kind of feel that could be a priority again?
It's funny. I wrote a.
I hope you don't have a girlfriend who's going to be listening to this, because then
no.
The answer then would be wrong.
Well, it's interesting because even after the aneurysm, I did go out on a couple of dates. And I wrote about this in a memoir that I wrote a few years ago. It sort of became like an episode of a sitcom where the focus was, okay, when do I bring up that I've had a ruptured brain aneurysm during our date?
Right, okay.
Do you suggest maybe you want to split the nachos for an appetizer? Oh, by the way, I need to, so
how did that go though? I mean, did you bring that into the conversation?
Yeah. Eventually, what I realized was I would see if there was a natural way, an organic way to work it in, I would bring it up. Otherwise I wouldn't. And it was always in my head. Everyone was always very nice once they if I told them, or they reacted in a very cool way about it. I think I couldn't sort of get out of my own way.
Right.
And then it became something where I realized, at some point, maybe I'll meet someone and I'll settle down and it'll be great. But as of right now, it's just not it's not something that I need to have happen. So I've sort of put it on the back burner. If there's one thing I've learned about the last couple of years, it's that nothing has met my expectation for how it'll go.
Right.
So I'm sort of just leaving it open as a possibility, as with everything else is. So I mean, it was interesting because I had been in a relationship and then that didn't work out. So I was like, you know what, this is important to me. This is something that I'd like to eventually establish again. And then after the aneurysm, I kept trying to sort of make it work. And I realized that I was sort of forcing the issue, that I was making it a priority when it wasn't one.
Right. So kind of like, instead of going with the flow of seeing how it works out, it was kind of in the way.
Yeah, I kept thinking, okay, well, if I remember there was a quotation that I really liked from a book and then a movie called Into the Wild, where one of the characters writes in the bindings of a notebook of his, happiness is only real when it's shared.
Yeah.
And I remember really, I don't necessarily agree with that now, but at the time I remember thinking, okay, that is really profound. So I want to find someone who I can share my happiness with. And then that became sort of a driving point.
Right.
And then it wasn't until, within the last 6 months or so that I've realized I can be happy without finding someone to necessarily share my happiness with in that regard.
Right.
But that took a lot of time to sort of assess. That was the sort of the one luxury of the last year and a half. So when I'd been doing the outpatient recovery, and then since I had been teaching beforehand, I thought I would get back into the teaching profession.
Yeah.
So I went back to my old high school and worked as a sub for a few months. But at the time at that job, I'd been working with students who have learning disabilities and attention deficit disorder.
Yeah.
So they really need somebody who's at 100% of their game. And I just wasn't at 100% of my game. So I backed away from that. And then in March of 2020, I was about to start a job where I would be a tutor. So it would be a little bit of a slower pace in a, in a much more calm environment at a tutoring center near where I lived. And then obviously the COVID pandemic hit, so that job was canceled. So I moved back in with my parents for a year, which turned out to be a silver lining because I could really reflect on what I wanted to do, and what were going to be the new goals, and how would it be best to keep adjusting. And that's when I sort of figured out pursuing a counseling degree would probably give me the drive, and things that I had wanted to pursue.
I'm sure your parents are delighted for you to be home anyway. I mean, mom and dad always love us home.
It was really, it was great. I mean, I get along really well with them. So it was nice to be home. Plus, I could do a lot of the chores and errands to make things easier for everyone. So we ended up having a really great time together where, I could lift heavy things if they needed to. I would make coffee in the morning. Plus we would get a chance to spend time together. So it was a really nice, opportunity.
Can I ask then, Andrew, when you were going through the treatment, and obviously I'm aware that treatment can be quite expensive in America, or insurances or health insurance, how how did you manage that side, but also the work side as well? Because unless you have a very considerate boss or employer, it's quite difficult, especially if you're trying to recover and you have the pressure of an employer to say, like, we need you back. I know you explained there that you had a couple of opportunities of work, but at that moment in time when you had the aneurysm, I mean, how did you cope with that?
Well, what's interesting is that I had actually just quit my job, my teaching job. I was going to try to go back to school to get a PhD. So I had applied to a bunch of schools, actually in Europe, coincidentally.
Right.
And then the aneurysm happened, and I didn't get into any of the programs. But at the time, I still had insurance through my previous job at the school. So that turned out to be a really fortunate thing, because that took care of most of the major medical bills. And then again, I was fortunate enough when I moved back in with my folks that I didn't have to worry so much about, the obligation of, okay, what am I going to do today?
Yes.
And then it wasn't really until I kind of figured everything out. I've been very fortunate in terms of things, the dominoes all lining up well, so that when they were knocked over, everything was still okay. But yeah, it was difficult in that there were a lot of times where I kept expecting this is what I should be doing,
Yes.
or this is what I would imagine somebody in this situation would do, rather than kind of just seeing, okay, well, what's the best thing for right now? I don't know if that answers any of your questions.
Yeah, no, it does. It's just trying to put it's, you've been through so much, and here you are talking on this podcast, and you're still very positive, and that's something that, that's great character on your behalf, that you're still moving forward, you're doing your thing. We're going to talk a lot more later on about your podcast and what holds out for you in 2022 and beyond. And you mentioned there you're going to do a clinical mental health counseling program. Just another question I just want to ask you, just for any listeners, I mean, or are you aware of, I mean, is a brain aneurysm preventable? That you know of? I know you mentioned that you're not a medical doctor, but have you heard, I mean, when the medical
Yeah.
professionals say to you, look, get yourself
So
checked out, or
yes, if you have a history, like if there's a family history, or if you're having debilitating headaches or anything, you can get a screening, and they can tell if you have an aneurysm there. So I had a ruptured aneurysm, which means that it burst.
right?
A lot of people have aneurysms that are unruptured, but they can be screened, and now they can. There are a couple of treatments. It can either be something called coiled or clipped, or it can be dealt with through surgery. So I would recommend, especially if you have a family history, it would always be a good idea to just get checked out. You hear stories, or I've heard stories in support groups of people who say, I had a bad headache and I didn't think it was anything. And then I went so I'm certainly not saying that if you have headaches, then that's a symptom.
Yeah.
But mostly if you know that there's a family history, it would probably be a good idea to get checked out. And then if you have persistent symptoms that you can't explain, then that's probably. But yeah, aneurysms can certainly be prevented.
What is that, Andrew? What it was, I know I mentioned this at the beginning of the show, is a subarachnoid hemorrhage. What is that specifically? Is that because your aneurysm, you said, kind of burst?
Yeah, so a subarachnoid hemorrhage, I think, is when you have a bleed that's in a certain area of the skull,
Right.
or the I was, again, I keep saying I was really fortunate, but I was in that most of the things that could have gone wrong went wrong, but were also somehow, either fixed, or they didn't end up having a debilitating problem that lasted.
Right.
So so a subarachnoid hemorrhage is like a specific type of bleed, either in the skull or on the brain. I wish my brother's a doctor, so if he were here, he'd be able to explain it to you much better.
No,
But
not at all. You've done a great job. Is then I'm looking at your website here and I'm very nosy at the moment. I think
that's
first of
okay.
all we'll chat about your plans for. I mean, we're actually in 2022 now, but you're participating in this clinical mental health counselling program. So what is that, and what do you hope to gain from it?
So the counseling profession is very similar to being a therapist or a psychologist. I think these days the words are interchangeable. What I would like to do is be able to help people who've had traumatic brain injuries, because I feel like there's a lot of support for physical recovery.
Yes.
There just isn't as much support for emotional or mental recovery during that period. So I thought that because I've experienced something like that myself, I could offer a unique perspective to help people through. And that was sort of my goal. I felt like I'm still doing a lot of the things that bring me fulfillment and enjoyment.
Yes.
I'm doing the Happy Hour with Heather and Guest podcast with my friend Heather, and I'm writing, but I also needed, or felt like I needed, to do something that would help other people.
Yes.
In order to kind of feel more fulfilled and complete. So,
and how long, Andrew, does this take? This qualification take? Is it like a couple of years or a 4-year course?
Yeah. So I'm doing the program as a full-time student. So hopefully it will only take 2 years. So I'm hoping to be practicing, by maybe 2025, 2024, 2025, sometime, but a lot of the students in the program do it part-time. So it'll probably take them maybe 5 years.
Right.
But yeah, it's basically, I think, a counselor would be someone you would go to get help if you're having, if you're struggling with emotional or mental difficulties, who would hopefully be able to help you put yourself back on track in a productive way.
Yeah, no, I think it's a brilliant idea. And as you mentioned already, if you've experienced it, not many people can, we can all go off and do qualifications, but you've been there, the recovery's like, and you can firsthand actually tell somebody or help somebody who's going to go through in the future. So I think it's a brilliant thing you're doing, and fair play to you. Now we're going to go on to now we're going to go on to do the Happy Hour podcast with Heather. So who is Heather? So who is she?
Okay, so what's interesting is I've actually never met Heather personally.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah, well, the pandemic has done some interesting things. So I had reached out to a marketing and PR person in music because I wanted ideas on how to promote some of the books I'd written. So I became friendly with this guy whose name is Matt Bacon, who still works as a marketing and PR person in the United States, although he has clients throughout the world. And he was giving a marketing seminar. And I ended up having the opportunity to enroll in the marketing seminar. And Heather had also enrolled in the marketing seminar.
Right.
So we became friendly with each other. And one of the tasks we had to do in the seminar was we had to create a Facebook group. So she created a group called Happy Hour with Heather and Guest, which originally was just going to be a place for people to post articles about bands and musicians and talk and listen to new music. And then as the pandemic got worse and musicians were unable to play live, they would live stream perform into the group. So they would set up in a rehearsal space where they lived, and they would stream the performance.
Wow.
So it shifted it shifted from kind of a place to post information into like a venue, basically. So Heather asked if I could help with that, and that's how I got involved. So the first year or so of the group was pretty much just a chance to showcase musicians who were struggling during the pandemic. And then we also included, every so often, we would interview musicians. And then more recently, as the pandemic, as musicians started to be able to play live gigs again, there were going to be fewer performances. So we decided to shift the focus and make the show more about music reviews. So rather than doing live performances, Heather and I talk about, contemporary bands that we like. We analyze albums. We make recommendations. And neither of us necessarily have a music background. So none of the things that we talk about are usually very technical. We're coming at it really from a fan's perspective.
And what would be your favorite music? What would be some of your artists that you like?
Well, she and I we're both huge fans of heavy metal. So that's usually what we focus the show on.
Right.
Which is, again, if you were to meet either of us or speak to either of us, neither of us really fit the cliched sort of look and sound of a heavy metal fan. So it's always interesting. Like I probably look like I should be, modeling on a J. Crew catalog, wearing like khakis and a button-down shirt. So it's a lot of fun, though. I mean, I think, these days it's really important to be fulfilled and have a good time when you can.
Yes.
Regardless if you're recovering from something or just dealing with everyday life, that's one of the great things about where technology is these days. Sort of anyone can do anything if you have the drive and you're persistent. So,
and you are persistent. I mean,
well, thank you. Yeah, so the show with Heather came about as a way to kind of originally satisfy this marketing course, and then it was going to be a place to kind of hang out. And then when the pandemic hit, it shifted and became a way to support musicians. And now it's just kind of a way for Heather and I to stay involved in the scene and have a good time and listen to good music and stuff like that. So,
and there's a friendship from this as well.
Yeah, I mean, she's become a good friend, and we do speak like on the phone or on Zoom, even when we're not recording shows. But yeah, it's interesting kind of how that's blossomed into a friendship.
No, it's great. I mean, so hello, Heather, from the Happy Hour with Heather and Guest podcast. So I'm just being very nosy with your website here, Andrew.
Yes.
So it's andrewdavie.com. And I had a question I wanted to ask you anyway, because you have lots of sections. You have your writing, you have the podcast, you have interviews and publicity, and you have your social media. But there's one question I want to ask, because I know some of your books, or nearly all of them, are on Amazon. What is, and this is from an Irishman, what was the leprechaun violence conjecture and other stories? What was that?
Okay, so the leprechaun violence conjecture was the first short story that I had ever published.
Right.
And then I decided, the first collection of short stories I released, I decided to call that the leprechaun violence conjecture and other stories. So when I was in grad school, I had the idea, and this was even something that I I had been a theater major in college, and I had written a one-act play that got performed at the school I went to. And at the time, I remember thinking sort of how idealistic I was, that I would only spend my time working on projects that I was really passionate about. So I remember thinking I would never write the script for one of the Leprechaun films. The horror movies, I'm sure.
Oh, yes. With Jennifer Aniston, was that the one?
Yeah, she's in the. So I remember thinking at the time they'd already written like 6 or 7 of them, and I remember thinking to myself, "Wow, what would it take for me to write one of these movies?" So then the story came about because it's kind of like Faust. It's sort of like, what would you do, or what would it take in your life for you to have written, the 5th Leprechaun movie, for example.
Okay.
And that, so I in the story, it's a question and answer format. It's 2 guys that are having a conversation, and one of them says, well, let me tell you about the leprechaun violence conjecture. And then he has different levels. So he says, on level 1, you're probably in your early 20s, you're really idealistic. You would never think to write one of these movies, even if you were given the chance. And then it sort of, it just keeps going. And as you get older and you become more materialistic and you learn how the world works, you would kind of sell your soul to have the opportunity to write, one of those movies.
It's brilliant because you've so many, but it's so, for somebody like myself, because I'm kind of boring when I read stuff. I just usually read biographies and stuff like that. But your books that you're writing, they're so random. Is that the way you'd like it?
Yeah, when I went, so I went back to school for writing, and when I was going back to school, I was very much somebody that thought they would write crime fiction,
right?
Because that at the time, that's what I was. I think like the Jack Reacher books had just come out,
right?
And I had already been a big fan of, there was a Spencer for Hire by Robert Parker. So I was very much under the impression that I was going to begin writing a series like that. And then when I got to graduate school, it was much easier to write short stories, because, you could just give somebody 3 pages and they could read the whole thing, instead of giving them 75 pages of a 200-page thing. And then they'd have to remember the order and what had happened. And it was much easier to write more pop culture based things in 3 pages. Right. So I sort of shifted, and I'm somebody who has like a natural reserve of obscure references to make, or, topics that are crazy, or things, I have a memory for, like, for example, right now, I could tell you the last 50 years of Best Picture Oscar winners off the top of my head.
Wow.
Yeah. So things like, the Leprechaun violence conjecture came from having an affinity for pop culture and being able to sort of pull from that. I wrote another story a while back about Superman getting drunk at a bar and discovering that Bizarro Superman is now dating his ex-girlfriend, and just sort of thinking about a scenario like that. So a lot of the early stories that I've published came from just these sort of scenarios. Right. I remember when I was in Macau reading about a zoo in Japan that would run drills in case there was another earthquake, and animals escaped from their enclosures. They had zookeepers dress up in animal costumes and simulate an escape, so that they could train. So I kept thinking, okay, well, what must it be like if you're a 25-year-old and you're wearing a Tony the Tiger outfit and you're running around a zoo, to simulate an escape. So sometimes I would just read these interesting things, and I would write, based on that. Sometimes I would just want to refer to a movie, so it was easier in college to write something short that was much more pop culture based. And it wasn't until within the last couple of years that I sort of returned back to writing longer work.
I mean, it's brilliant. I mean, all your website information, any listeners that want to get in touch with Andrew, I mean, he has some fascinating titles here. He has The Vague, From Beyond, Land of Illusions. There was one there that, where's my one? It wasn't Three Little Pigs, which was the one? It was, The Accuracy of Third Eye Blind. I'm going to have a look at that one later on. But so where else then can our listeners, Val Kilmer's Elbow.
Yeah, so yeah.
Just because I'm a big fan of Top Gun and Val Kilmer.
Yeah, I know that. And
what's that all about?
if you've ever seen the movie Heat,
yeah.
So Val Kilmer has a deformity on his elbow from when he was shooting the film The Doors.
Right.
I think he was crowd surfing and they dropped him and he broke his elbow. So I wrote a story where I think the elbow deformity starts talking to someone. Right. Just crazy sort of things like that. The Accuracy of Third Eye Blind, that I read an article by a great writer named Chuck Klosterman, who discussed how the album by Radiohead, Kid A, he said, if you listen to the lyrics, it predicts the events of 9/11. And I remember thinking, is there an album that predicted the events of my life, for example? And I realized that Third Eye Blind's debut album, if you take all the titles, I could essentially make them work. So I wrote what's called a chapbook, which is like a short, it's like a 20-page book type thing, just about how each title lined up with various events of my life.
It's amazing. I mean, but I will be wondering about Val Kilmer's Elbow later on. That's on the Daily Drunk, so I'll be having a look at that as well. So where else then, Andrew, can listeners get in touch with you if they want to get in touch? Are you on the social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram?
Yeah, I mean, the website's probably the best place because everything is there, including social media links. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, just as a Davie author. And then the website, andrew-davie.com, will have everything, really, from Happy Hour with Heather and Guest to things that I've written, even a contact page. So that's probably the best place.
Well, I have to say, just listening to you there for the last hour, Andrew, you're an amazing person to chat to, and great inspiration for other people, especially those who may be going through a difficult time at the moment, either physically or mentally. So I'd like to thank Andrew Davie for joining me on the Wellbeing and Choreographer podcast today. Thanks so much, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.